What is going on, everybody? This is Krish Mohan, host of your show, and these are your pre-show announcements. Hey, I want to let you guys know about some changes in virtual shows. Going forward, I will not be doing Forkful of Noodles in front of a virtual audience. There will be new Forkful of Noodles episodes recorded, but they will be pre-recorded without an audience, just to give me a little bit more time to produce the quality of content that I would like to produce, and make sure that I'm not rushing things and missing elements of the story, of the history, of the perspective that I'm trying to share. If you guys are looking for those Forkful recordings on my calendar, they are no longer going to be on there. But what I will be doing are virtual stand up comedy nights, similar to what I did a few weeks ago. And those are going to be, straight stand up comedy of new material or, old material that I'm trying to brush up and kind of tweak and make better. So they'll pretty much be workshop nights. And they'll primarily be me workshopping some new jokes with you guys, because it's very difficult to figure out if something is funny without an audience. So I wanted to continue doing some sort of virtual show, and I thought that would be a fun way to do that. Those shows are probably only going to be about an hour, and they will be on Thursday nights. The dates for those are listed on my website at krishmohanhaha.com, krishmohanhaha.com. But the next one is going to be March 24th. March 24th is going to be the next one. It is rescheduled from last week's show, which was canceled due to some personal strife, linked to some political debacles that I addressed in last week's episode. So March 24th. Mark your calendars for March 24th, and come join me for a night of virtual stand-up comedy. And I'm going to be on tour with my good friend Ron Placone. We're going to be on tour from April 16th through the 25th. We're coming to Pittsburgh, to Toronto, to Ottawa, Montreal, Burlington, Portland, Maine, Boston, Massachusetts, and New York City. So if you're in those cities, grab tickets for those shows right now. Go do it right now. You can go to my website, krishmohanhaha.com, krishmohanhaha.com, or over at ronplacone.com as well. It'd be great to see you guys out on the road. I'm excited to share some new material with you guys. I'm excited to share, brush up some older material that I haven't done in quite some time, and just have a really fun time on tour. It's I haven't been on a tour since the pandemic started, so I'm very very much looking forward to it. So come hang out at these shows, if you guys are interested in becoming sustaining members, because I think now it's more important than ever to support independent content creators and independent journalists as well, that not only help inform you but help inform people like me. Please do make a contribution to an independent news source. If you wanted to make a contribution to my show, you can go to my website and make a one-time donation, or become a sustaining member and make monthly contributions. So if you're looking to do something like that, and again, this is not me asking, hey, choose between rent and supporting me. I'm never going to ask you guys to do that. That is the extreme that certain people like to take it. That's not what any of us are advocating for. But if you have a couple extra bucks and you're looking to support a good cause, myself or any of the other independent media outlets out there would be a good one to check out. And if you want to support me, you can go directly to my website, krishmohanhaha.com, krishmohanhaha.com. All right, now onwards to the What is going on, everybody? Welcome to a new episode of Taboo Table Talk, and we got a pretty good one for you guys today. Mickey Huff is back on the show. If you guys remember Mickey from the previous episodes, he is part of Project Censored. He's a host of the Project Censored radio and podcast. And if you want to learn some media literacy, this is your guy. Mickey is the media literacy guy, in my opinion. He's written some fantastic books and textbooks as well. We discussed his textbook a little bit in this episode as well. But we get into a lot of different stuff. We get into what Project Censored is doing, some of the censored stories of 2021. And we get into something that's pretty important, a very clear definition of the code of ethics for journalists that is put together by the Society of Professional Journalists, and I'll talk a little bit more about them at the end preamble there, to give you guys a little bit more insight into them. And I do want to get somebody from the SPJ on this podcast, because again, I think this conversation is very important for today's day and age, and in light of a lot of recent events, right? We are looking at wartime, and in wartime, how the media reports the war, and what information is left out, what information is decided to be carried forward, is really, really important to decipher and to understand, what journalists, what code of ethics journalists are supposed to operate from. So I was very excited to bring that to the conversation, or rather have Mickey bring to the conversation. And again, we'll kind of go over them towards the end of the interview. We also talk about corporate media and how it's deteriorating critical thought, and what are some of the tools that they are using to deteriorate critical thought in this country. And again, you can kind of see it based on how the crisis in Ukraine is being covered. And I do want to make a quick note. This episode was recorded, I believe, about 2 weeks ago. So, some of the things in regards to the Ukraine crisis, although we didn't really get into the weeds of the Ukraine crisis, some of the information that we bring up has had some newfound clarity to it. So if we're not up to date on that information, that is because this was recorded 2 weeks ago, and that's just how time works. So don't blame me, blame time, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. That's crazy. Don't blame a constant of the universe. It has nothing to do with your biases or not. So anyway, I think this is an incredibly important episode. These are incredibly important topics to discuss, and and I'm not trying to be mean here or anything, but the United States, as a populace, the citizens of the United States are the most propagandized citizens on any planet, and have very little media literacy. Full-grown adults don't understand the difference between journalism and propaganda and infotainment, right? And we often call infotainment journalism, and real journalism propaganda, and real propaganda infotainment. You know what I mean? It's just this bullshit cycle that we all live in. And again, people like Mickey Huff are experts in media literacy, and can and do have teach courses and have written books in terms of understanding what the media is. And that's what all the conversations that I've had with Mickey, especially on this podcast, have always been about. So if you're unfamiliar with Mickey, if you're unfamiliar with Project Censored, this will help you get familiar with them. And then I would recommend going back into the annals of Taboo Table Talk history and finding those past episodes with Mickey, because there's a lot of information that will kind of help you see some patterns within corporate media and their coverage of a lot of different issues, and probably lead you to real journalists that follow the code of ethics for journalists and report the news the way that the news is supposed to be reported. And if they're going to give you an opinion, or if they're going to give you their personal political viewpoints, they make a statement to let you know that that's what they're doing, whereas corporate media often does not. And you also kind of see how language is used. So there's a lot of things in terms of media literacy, and again, I really think being media literate is not a big ask for a society as large as the United States, or anywhere else. I feel like media literacy should be something that we're all taught and that we're all aware of, so that wartime propaganda can be used against us, from any country, from any nation. So and kind of critical thought is what we are concentrated on. So without any further ado, let's dive into this conversation with Mickey Huff from Project Censored. Enjoy.
I'm like you. I am ultimately interested in the bigger pictures. If people really want to take a deep dive into the stories, they're all online at projectcensored.org.
Beautiful.
Some of the other stuff that is in the book that's not always online is the junk, the news abuse, the media democracy in action, which is really a great chapter because it's, it highlights people who are really doing things that are good in media and journalism around First Amendment issues. So I always try to add something in about those because it talks about solutions to challenges, not just hand-wringing and bemoaning the problem, right? Because we're good at that.
We are. I think that's part of the reason I like talking to you is because you do that, and that takes us right. What an expertly way to transition into a first topic. This is why you're in the big leagues, Mickey. Is no, I think this is something that I think everybody that does anything on the internet deals with, which is the gatekeeping from big tech giants like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter. And the question that always pops up is, should they be the arbiter of free speech? Because that's what it always boils down to is they are dictating who gets to say what on their platforms. So how does a company like a Facebook or a Twitter contend with that issue?
Again, Krish, that's a great place to start. Basically, we're diving into the weeds of contemporary censorship. Mm-hmm. And of course, some can't wrap their head around the fact that that's censorship because it's different than the First Amendment and legal definitions of prior restraint. The idea that private companies with these technologically communicative platforms, that's a charitable way that they might describe them, these are companies that are operated for private profit. And we sometimes forget that because we as, quote, users of digital technology, we sign up on Facebook, the boomer book, mm-hmm. Or Instagram or TikTok or Twitter or Snapchat or whatever the other 100 ones that I don't know about yet, etc. The point is that there can be censorship that takes place in the, quote, marketplace of ideas that is every bit as insidious and pernicious as the sort of traditional kinds of prior restraint where government interferes with the free flow of information, which is technically forbidden by the First Amendment. Mm-hmm. And of course, there are always there's always exceptions to this, right? So again, it's as much as I pretend to be a First Amendment absolutist, the more reasonable part of me, which sometimes is small, but the more reasonable, as my critics might suggest.
You are American. We don't expect the logic and reason to be
Yeah. So being charitable to myself, um, if I can be a philanthropist for my own shortcomings and boost my flaws to a lesser degree. So, but we digress. The problem of censorship is real, and social media is a place where many people are virtually congregated. And so, this idea that Facebook, Meta owns Facebook, owns etc. It's their playground. You signed up to play on it. You agreed to their terms, and they will allow you to use that platform as long as it doesn't, quote, violate whatever their vague nebulous community standards are. If you follow whatever their other rules are, if you submit to their so-called fact checkers. Now look, you start going down that list, and you start to realize that there's a lot more rules here than there seem to be in the public square, as it were, or the commons for public communication. And this is where we get into the weeds in the new Project Censored book, The State of the Free Press 2022. Andy Lee Roth and I, we talk about how all of this technology, however, when they talk about us as media users or consumers, that's really kind of telling, because we're consuming this product that we're actually providing content for. And then they basically kind of claim ownership of it in a lot of ways. And they also then tailor it, curate it, algorithmically play up to our confirmation biases. They harvest data. This is about surveillance capitalism. We're not getting to use this stuff for free. They're using us and our data to either further manipulate us and to further profit, whether it's through advertising, selling eyeballs to advertisers, or to further curate things to tailor them to us in other ways that benefit those that own those platforms. So that's hardly innocuous. DARPA, if you go back, we write about this in the beginning of the book because we write about challenges to journalism. And so I think your question that got us kicked off here at the deep end is a serious one that says, like, well, what do you mean there's censorship? We have the internet, we have all these platforms, we have so many places to get information, more than anybody has ever had in human history. And it even transcends, in many cases, not in all, but it transcends things like class lines, where people even of limited means can often have access to things like a cell phone or internet access and all these applications. So, we go through in the book and we talk about censorship by proxy, if you will. DARPA is the Defense Department's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And it is basically, it's like the Rand Corporation in some similarities. This is basically the R&D arm of the military industrial surveillance complex that goes back to the Cold War, the 1950s. You're aware of this. Many of your viewers and listeners might be aware of it, but most Americans aren't. They're not aware that a lot of the research and money and investment and ideas and technology were literally developed for war making or Orwellian defense making purposes during the Cold War. So things like DARPA, if you look at them, they play a crucial role in the development of computer networking that made the internet and related innovations, from global positioning systems, GPS, or drones, a reality. So historically, and Gore, as Gore Vidal suggested, we live in the United States of amnesia, where we are quick to forget things, or we're also more of, we rarely take a stroll down memory hole lane as Americans. A lot of fun history that gets stuffed and disappeared down those holes, Winston Smith style. And so a lot of Americans, that they're just not aware that this stuff happened. And so you can't connect dots if you don't know what all the dots are. And so part of what we're getting into here, and part of this algorithmic gatekeeping that Andy Roth also writes about in the Marcaz Review, we've done shows at the Project Censored show about it, we cover numerous stories about it over the years. I think they really pose significant questions about what is censorship in the 21st century. What are these private for-profit platforms called social media? More what I would call anti-social media in a lot of ways. These companies that designed these went and they consulted with psychologists. They consulted with people who were behind making gambling machines and things in Las Vegas. for dopamine hits to make people addicted to their platforms. There's a lot that goes behind the scenes here that, when you really start to take a look, it's pretty down and dirty. It's pretty manipulative. It really isn't about better angels and people communicating and I get to visit grandma from across the globe. Those are all the feel-good advertisements for that kind of technology that says it can be really great for you. And that's true. And this is, of course, where a lot of the challenges lie, Krish, is that just because that's true doesn't mean that all the criticisms of these platforms are not also true.
Right.
Because they are. And we now live in a society where privacy is fast a thing of the past. And while some claim, well, what do I care? I have nothing to hide. Every single person has something they'd rather other people not know about or know about in a way that's framed by yourself, not manipulated by others wishing to cause harm or manipulate data. And these firms are very, very good at manipulating data, curating algorithmically things to our proclivities and sensibilities. They're also great at burying certain thoughts and ideas, disappearing them, shadow banning. People, joke about Facebook jail. These are really real things where people sometimes are just banned off these platforms and they have no idea why. Mm-hmm. So the reframing of this is that when you have these kind of companies that have such deep roots with federal funding, tax breaks, taxpayer support, and they have become de facto centerpieces of what we used to call the public square, the commons. We really have to start thinking about regulating these kinds of platforms, and we really need to seriously think about what deplatforming means. Mm-hmm. And this started in many ways with the deplatforming of then President Donald Trump, and many liberals and people on the left celebrated the silencing of Donald Trump so he could no longer bloviate on Twitter, etc. And, we were among the few voices, along with Mint Press News and some others that said, that while we don't, I didn't miss hearing the idiotic ruminations of Donald Trump. It's journalists that helped amplify his venal, banal messaging. Yeah. It's journalists that got lazy and followed him around on Twitter by the nose. It's journalists that bear responsibility for becoming a cesspool of sensationalism. It's not just Donald Trump that did that. We all did it, and this whole industry did it. And Daniel McLean, the Society of Professional Journalists, writes in the foreword to our new book that it's this industry needs reformed. It needs built up in the public interest. And so, while criticizing some of these things and the way the new censorship looks, Krish, in the book, we do talk at length about journalists that are doing great alternative independent work outside the corporate so-called mainstream. We highlight and accentuate those voices. We also highlight the Society of Professional Journalists Professional Ethics or Code of Ethics, right? And we encourage people to follow journalists that follow these and not so much those in the corporate press. And of course, we bemoan that many people are now getting their news from social media as an aggregator, which leads to more problems of confirmation bias. So social media platforms are filled with poster children for Dunning-Kruger. You know what I mean? People masquerading as armchair experts on everything. The people that were experts last month on Spotify and Joe Rogan are now experts on the Ukraine. And you know what I'm getting at. So,
absolutely.
We at Project Censored really just try to highlight critical media literacy education as a means by which for people to understand the complicated sort of media ecosystems that we now inhabit.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm guilty of getting my news from the aggregate that is Facebook, but now we have great other sources like Rad Indie Media and Project Censored. You guys show us a bunch of stories that corporate media is not going to cover, a bunch of stories that Facebook isn't going to bump to the top of the algorithm.
Absolutely.
You mentioned the code of ethics for journalists, and I think in today's day and age now, I think that's important to know that does exist. Because I mean, this is conversations I have on a regular basis, right? Is because corporate media is so untrustworthy and has consistently proven to be not just, they're just blatant liars, like they're selling you lies. I think people look at even independent journalists and and go, well, where are they getting their money from? What is their agenda? And to me, I don't see a lot of independent journalists that have a particular agenda, because they're mostly funded by us, by average people, donating to their publication every month. So what are these codes that these journalists are operating under, and what corporate media should be operating under?
That's a fantastic question, and a great way to discuss some of the other examples of what we think at the project, journalism in the public interest actually looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the independent alternative journalists, it's not as if they walk around pretending to be objective, which is what the corporate press has done, right? We report, you decide, the most trusted name in news, on and on. They write, it's like, it's good stand up, right?
Oh man, I wish I was that funny.
Yeah. Right. The irony might be lost on them. I mean, whenever you see these groups like Brian Stelter over at CNN, bemoaning Joe Rogan, for ruining journalism. And it's like, Joe Rogan's not a journalist, doesn't pretend to be one, doesn't claim to be one. Spotify isn't a journalistic outlet or a platform, never claimed to be. The real beef the establishment legacy media have is that Rogan has 11 million viewers on average a week, and they all combined can't seem to muster it. So this is not unlike the attacks that you saw in the legacy press of newspapers against radio when it was a budding new technology, and they used the War of the Worlds broadcast to spread fear in the populace about why radio was dangerous propaganda, because the newspapers were never dangerous propaganda before. So at any rate, back here to this code of ethics, again, and if CNN, if the cable networks want to blame Joe Rogan, they should take a time out and go look in the mirror. They got where they are due to their own due diligence of doing shoddy sensationalist journalism. That's just a simple story. It's a long one that we've outlined in all of our books, including United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation, and Post-Truth America, all the annual censored books, etc. But the core for us, and what we use as sort of a metric, if you will, is the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. And it's simple. There's 4 tenets to it. 1, seek truth and report it. So journalists should be responsible for the accuracy of their work. Did I say accuracy? Yes. Accuracy is another one of the things that we're talking about when we talk about seeking truth and reporting it, right? Minimizing harm. That's another major part of the code of ethics. Journalists should treat sources, subjects, colleagues, and members of the public as human beings that deserve respect. By the way, you can read all this at spj.org. That's the Society's website. You can get this stuff for free. I've got the poster printed out, and it's on, I chair journalism at the Diablo Valley College, and, we have that poster in the newsroom, right? With the code of ethics on it. So you've got the first is seek truth and report it, minimize harm, act independently. You should avoid conflicts of interest. You just mentioned one of the major ones, follow the money. The other is cui bono, who benefits, right? Who benefits from my reporting a story in a certain way or not reporting at all? Which voices are heard, which aren't, right? And of course, that all ties into this acting independently. And the last of the ethics is be accountable and transparent. Ethical journalism means taking responsibility for one's work and explaining one's decisions to the public, meaning, why did we report this way? Where did we get this information? Did we reach out to other parties and couldn't reach them for comment? Did we not bother at all? This is, again, nuts and bolts of the practice of journalism. But if general readers of news and people that are really interested in being informed and they want to ascertain the veracity of news sources, it helps if they understand the Society Journalist Code of Ethics. It matters. Ethics matters. And in the censored book this year, Danielle McLean, who used to chair the ethics committee there, she reminds us of the state of the free press and how these ethics could really work to rebuild trust in legacy journalistic outlets. Now, I would suggest also, Krish, that rather than wait around for that to happen, we look at the great examples that already exist around us. So each year at Project Censored, we compile a list of the top underreported stories. We've got about 30 judges. We work with 20 some campuses around the United States. Several hundred students and a couple dozen professors each year work with us, submitting stories, researching stories, vetting and validating stories. It's something we call validated independent news stories. It is an assignment, a critical media literacy assignment that virtually any faculty member can introduce into a particular class they teach across the curriculum, whether it's about science journalism or about environmental journalism or literally in the social sciences or liberal arts, political science, etc. All with a critical bent, right? And if you go to the site, what we try to do is teach people how to seek out independent sources. So we've got entire lists at Project Censored of vetted independent news sources. We've got stories currently being researched under review. And of course, we have, dating back to our founding in 1976, the top underreported or censored stories for each year, including in the new book at projectcensored.org. The methodology is explained, the curriculum is there, it's all there for free. So we want people to take it.
What more do you want?
I mean, there's an idiom, right? You can lead the horse to water. What the horse does when it gets to the water. There's a great New Yorker cartoon that Andy Roth shared with me once upon a time that has this person leading the horse to the proverbial water. Yet when the horse gets to the water, one of the horses is playing with a beach ball, another horse is spitting water out like a fountain, and the person sitting on the side of the pond is like, I said drink, damn it. We do what we can, and like you said earlier, we're all guilty of falling down on our own best practices of being informed readers of the news. So it's important that we remind each other of these things. And we like to do at Project Censored is what we like to call is we're critical of the corporate press, but we're also affirmative. We're affirmative insofar as finding independent journalistic examples that do quality public reporting that's factually, transparently sourced and about key issues about which people need to know. But we're also affirmative when the New York Times or the Washington Post or the New York Times likes to they like to partner with ProPublica once in a while. They do some fantastic reporting. So it gets frustrating to people who really pay a lot of attention to the news to see the propaganda, the half-truths and falsehoods spewing from places like the New York Times about Russia and Ukraine or U.S. history of NATO and the Cold War. I just covered that again this past week in the Project Censored show with Harvey Wasserman on nuclear fallout, environmental problems, Peter Kuznick of American University, author of Untold History of the United States. These people are available. These people are voices of reason. These people are great contextualizers of current events. Why are they not on CNN? Why are they not being interviewed over at the Wall Street Journal? Well, I think you and I know that why, Krish, and that's because they're not on that narrative. They don't have the pro-war, pro-NATO, pro-expansionist, anti-Russiagate, Russiagate narrative, right? And so if you don't fit into that narrow, now you can debate wildly in that little box, right? About just how bad is Putin and when will he invade and how bad will it be? But anything that falls outside of those is left on the cutting room floor. And what the public gets then is a skewed perception of what is possible or what is being debated or what is debatable. And that is a great disservice that these major journalistic institutions do to the public. And the more the public becomes aware of them, the less the public tends to trust them, unless it's reverting back to our own confirmation biases, because those are our own weak spots. When I hear something from one of those sources that I agree with, right, my first inclination is like, yes, I'm on the right side. When I don't hear it, I'm like, they're liars and propagandists. Well, Krish, they're both. And so am I. And so are you. So are we all. I think it's just important that we kind of play fair and play with the same standards as George Carlin, a great investigative comic in his own right, historically, once said, let's not have a double standard here. One standard will do just fine. And I think for journalism, that's also what we need. And the SPJ helps provide that with its code of ethics. And every year we line up these stories. And I would encourage people to go to projectcensored.org to see what they are. There's always going to be critics saying, like, you didn't cover this, you didn't cover that. I lost all respect for Project Censored because you won't cover something happening with the Great Reset or the COVID vaccines. Well, sometimes we don't know enough yet, and sometimes information is still coming out, and it hasn't exactly been researched or vetted the degree to which we think it's responsible to write about. So remember, writing books in real time is hard to do because they come out after a period, right? We live in the instant gratification culture. It's like, I need to know what's going to happen 2 years from now, right now. We expect the unexpectable. We expect the unreasonable in many ways. In fact, the historian Daniel Boorstin wrote about this in 1962 in a book called The Image, a guide to pseudo events in America, that really predicted the mess that we were heading toward. Later by Marshall McLuhan, the great Postman, Great Neil Postman, Ben Bigdickian. I mean, there's plenty of people that warned us about the great morass in the propaganda landscape of 21st century digital media. But many of us maybe didn't pay heed. And Project Censored, founded in the 70s, is really out of that tradition of media studies and media criticism. So again, to focus on positive, we encourage people to look at some of those stories in the first chapter of the book every year, to look at some of what's happened to the previous censored stories, so that people can kind of get their own idea and develop their own relationships with sources, with stories, even with topics that if the corporate media does cover, they distort or marginalize or leave out key details or context. But in some of the cases, Chris, the corporate media doesn't cover the stories at all, in which case they would be more traditionally seen as censored, not just underreported.
Yeah, there's a lot to definitely unpack in that. But you bring up really good points, and a lot of it again has to do with trust. And that's something that I've had, it becomes a very difficult conversation to have with people when the source that you bring up is a source that they don't trust.
Right.
And I think this journalistic code of ethics, first of all, I think this should be taught to high school kids. Like everybody should know that.
Absolutely. There's no question. Well, there's this thing called civics. But the core of understanding civics isn't the banal platitudes. It's not just the theory, it's the praxis. Let's dive into the weeds on the very controversial things happening around us where people have disagreements, and let's start ironing them out, right? Let's look at a history of First Amendment issues. Let's look at a history of free press issues. Let's look at previous controversies and how they were handled. I could not agree with you more about the role education should be playing here. And Nolan Higdon and I in the United States of Distraction really talked about public vulnerabilities, the collapse of public education and the collapse of journalism in the public interest being two of the most significant over the last 50 years that have led us to this post-truth conundrum, right? The I'm right, you're wrong, no matter what kind of approach, because I don't agree with your source and your source is biased, but mine somehow isn't. Right. And I know that this says reductionist for some people because education's not enough and education's too long. And what about the people that have already been miseducated? Well, they can be re-educated. They can be educated again for the first time. Fill in the blanks. There's always hope when people are willing to open their mind and admit they don't know everything. And in the book that we did recently from Routledge is called Let's Agree to Disagree. It's a critical thinking textbook. So right out the bat, it's an academic textbook trying to help people learn how to be better critical thinkers. It's probably not going to be a New York Times bestseller.
What?
But it ought to be, not because we wrote it. In fact, we cite so many different diverse sources on it to try to purposely show people the many different ways that we can agree to disagree with each other and not give up hope that we can convince people who have deep-seated beliefs, however harmful they might be, that we can change their mind. The African-American activist Daryl Davis springs to mind, who spent years meeting with members of the Ku Klux Klan and talked to them about their racism, white supremacy, systemic racism, and collected their hoods and their uniforms, some hundreds of people that he was able to convince to renounce their deep-seated irrational fear and hatred of others based on race. Race is learned, it's mimicked, it's It's stuff that we see in our media, in our entertainment, infotainment, humilitainment media, right? So if it's learned, it can be taught beyond. It can be unlearned. We can teach new things. And what we do at Project Censored is we try to show people stories from marginalized communities, stories that should be commonplace in everyone's discourse or dialogue, but they often aren't because, well, the people telling the stories don't look like me, so how are they relevant, right? And we always run into that. And so we need to remember that representation matters, who's considered newsmakers, news shapers matters, who's considered worthy or unworthy victims in media matters, going back to Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's propaganda model. Again, there's a lot of things, Krish, we can do to broaden our perspectives, to overcome many of the challenges that we face. But we all have to be willing to put that in. And again, I'm going to come back to your statement about education. We are all teachers. We are all students. We all can take the opportunities to do that in different ways. You do it in a really fabulous way, not just with your podcasting conversations, but you do it through humor. Sometimes dark humor, sometimes cynical humor, sometimes self-deprecating humor, but humor is a really interesting tool. We have to be sure to and be careful that we're not punching down and rather punching up, as it were. Sometimes that gets confusing depending upon where one finds oneself. But those are useful tools. And if we can laugh at ourselves, then I think that we have hope that we can sort of reconfigure the way we see the world and the way others see us. This is, again, part of the mission, we think, that critical media literacy plays. And that's why for the last 45 years, Project Censored has over and over again, by example, tried to show what we think ethical journalism in the public interest looks like, who's doing it this year, and who to watch coming up, while we deconstruct news abuse propaganda, while we talk about and poke fun at the junk news distractions that dominate our airwaves, so we can't seem to get away from Kim Ye and Pete Davidson and other things that we don't need to know about. But what are we missing when we focus on those stories? You know, everybody has a guilty pleasure. Everybody likes some people like baseball, some people like wrestling, some people like music, some people like the movies. Some people always look for a way like, well, how do I unwind? How do I turn off my brain? I'm too overloaded with too much stuff, too much information. So I'm not talking about guilty pleasure escapes. I'm talking about the fact that we cannot avoid some of this nonstop round-the-clock distraction, whether it's Gorilla Glue Girl or grief porn or humilitainment, or the news abuse propaganda, the relentless other sideism, false balancing. There's a lot of propaganda and nonsense that fills up the corporate news media airwaves, which frankly leads people to not trust it as an accurate information disseminator. So now we're back to that, right? And then social media seems to have filled those gaps. And then that gets back to our definition of censorship, social media, deplatforming. We're in flux, Krish, in the 21st century digital era. Things are changing faster than most of us can keep up with. So I think we need all the help we can get. And I think that means we should be helpful to one another and supportive of one another. We shouldn't find the one or two things where we think each other are wrong or we disagree and litmus test people out of our social circles and ostracize them. I think that's a very foolish game that many play from left to right. And I think that if you really believe in the First Amendment, if you really believe in the free press and free speech and expression, then you really do embrace what it means to agree to disagree and allow dialogue and discourse to take place, particularly when it adheres to those ethics and those principles that we put forward earlier.
Yeah, I mean, you see it especially now. Just within the 2 months of this year, I think I've seen it more. Where if you say anything nice about China, then you're a communist who's supporting human rights violations that we don't have any evidence for, right? Like if you don't say anything terrible about Putin, or if you mention that the United States and NATO are also responsible for what's going on in Ukraine, and there's 50 years of history, 5-6 decades of history that are compounded
back to the
to
50s at least easily, and then some. But
yeah,
exactly.
you know, it's like, well, now you don't care about fascism or so, or you're a Putin apologist, or I mean, it's absurd.
The litmus testing is loud. You know, it's really a thing. And I resist it, although that doesn't mean I'm not subject to it.
Mm,
I'm mindful that I try not to subject people to litmus testing in that way. I'm curious as to why somebody has a more nuanced position on, say, Ukraine, Russia,
right.
than I do. So I'll read various people. I'll read from the establishment press or from the think tank establishments. I'll read from various degrees on the left. You know, I'll look at what different historians say. Um, you know, I'm curious as to what when Abby Martin of Empire Files, has to say about it,
Yeah.
or Oliver Stone, who did documentaries on Ukraine and interviews with Vladimir Putin. But I'm also very, very interested in what scholarly journalists like Eric Draitser have to say, an anti-imperialist journalist, right? Who's very, very steeped in Ukraine-Russia histories and is very erudite on the topic. And reminds us of the nuances and things, that it's not just, Ukraine isn't just run by neo-Nazis. That's sloppy thinking. Did the U.S. involve itself in Ukrainian governing affairs in 2014 in the Obama-Biden administration? Yes. Did we, in terms of that administration, want to sort of change outcomes? Has there been some stoking of hostilities from the West? Sure. But does that make us pro-Putin? No.
Right. Absolutely not. That's the other thing, is you can have two simultaneous opinions. Holy shit, is that even right?
Wow,
It's just like,
cognitive
what?
dissonance.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Like you can look at how two sides have screwed up, and really at the end of the day, who the victims of all these things are going to be are just average Ukrainians.
Yes, and absolutely. And we should not lose sight of that. We should not lose sight of the fact, too, since we're kind of on that topic momentarily.
Yeah.
We shouldn't lose sight of the anti-LGBTQIA plus policies that go on in Putin's Russia. We should not be oblivious to the nuclear threats that are connected to all of this.
Absolutely.
We should not be blind to his gross violations of press freedoms in the country. We should also not be blind to the many massive protests that are mobilizing there right now against his attack on Ukraine. I mean, again, there's so many things here that we all have to hold simultaneously. And so another kind of thing that since I'm an educator, that I like to talk about, I'm teaching, not preaching,
Mm-hmm.
is it's often both and, not either or.
Yeah.
It's and then some. And we may hierarchically rearrange what we think is prioritized or more important based on how we're currently ranking our values, or how we've been conditioned societally. But if we leave room open for other people to hear what they're saying, critical listening is a big component of critical media literacy. And when we talk about people hearing the stories and the narratives that they don't hear, we're asking them to challenge their own beliefs and their own ideas and own ideologies. We're inviting them into a space of cognitive dissonance to dance together. And where do we come out on the other end? And as I mentioned, sometimes laughter is a good medicine, because if we're not laughing, we might be crying. So it's good to have those. And some of the stories, that we look at just this year, to give your audience an idea, some of our stories are prescription drug costs are set to become a leading cause of death for elderly Americans, meaning elderly Americans that are increasingly reliant on Medicare, other insurance programs to get medicines that they've come to depend upon. Between inflation and big pharma price gouging, they can't afford medicines.
Yeah.
I mean, so that's different than COVID-19. That's different than big pharma is the devil because of, fill it in this week.
Blah, blah, blah. Right.
But this is something that's like by design, right? And so where is the attention to this? What about the fact that there was a historic wave of wildcat strikes that's been going on since last fall? Major labor movement stuff going on here, where people are rising up, and you're seeing people say the Great Resignation, people are lazy, they don't want to work. Nonsense. People don't mind working when they're getting paid for the work they do that is commensurate with the contribution to the overall economy. Amazon is built on exploitation, for example, right? These kinds of, you see it all the time. Now they're trying to unionize. Amazon says no. Jeff
Mm-hmm.
Bezos wants to have his, erectile dysfunction launch into space while he's not paying workers to make it possible, right? And it's, why is he doing that anyway? We're not going to psychoanalyze that any further. But the point is like, these are billionaire capitalists that are opposed to labor. The
Yeah.
fact that we uncritically use Amazon to buy all this stuff, right, fuels that kind of labor policy, whether we like it or not. It puts local businesses out of business, right? And those dots have to be connected. The corporate media aren't interested in labor. They're interested in corporate profits.
Mm-hmm.
Labor bites into corporate profits. By design, corporate media are biased against labor. Why do you think they call it a labor dispute? They don't call it a management problem. They don't call it an investor dilemma. They call it a labor problem or a labor shortage. There's no shortage of labor. There's shortage of generosity and fairness among the capitalist robber barons that won't distribute wealth, redistribute it down while they distribute it up. These are the kind of stories that we talk about in the censored book. Climate debtor nations have colonized the atmosphere. In other words, the global south is paying a much harsher price for the climate crisis, right? Again, we could go on and on. Police using dogs as instruments of violence, targeting people of color. Yeah, man, this is like in 2022, 21, 2020, not 1965. Right? When the pictures of dogs chasing African Americans down the streets of Carolina while police were, bludgeoning them with their cudgels. This is happening now in the United States, where schools are more segregated than they were over half a century ago. Those are the kind of stories we call attention to. And notice, I'm going to say this to flip the coin, notice that there's a negative bias to some of those stories. And people, Krish, I can't hear all that bad news. I'm just trying to take care of my family. I'm just trying to make ends meet here. I know that I should care about this stuff, but it's hard. Okay, I get it. So what's going on that's good? Well, we also talk about that. We talk about seed sovereignty movements that challenge corporate monopolies, for example. We call out activists who call out a legacy of racism and sexism through forced sterilization. And first you say, well, that sounds negative. But calling it out, stopping it, and doing something about it is not negative, it's positive. It's not the reactive knee-jerk, I got to go crawl into my snail shell. It's, I got to come out and I got to go do something about this. And if I can see where it intersects in my own lives, my own communities, my own families more easily, this is a way to get more involved, right? We can't be involved in everything.
Yeah.
But we can be involved locally in the things that really matter to us. And that's why we hope that people, when they pick up the censored book, they take a look at those stories. They take a look at what's happened to previous stories, because sometimes they do get picked up by the corporate media. They do get their day in the sunlight, right? And we want to affirm that. We like to, we also have the junk food news chapter. That's kind of our snide, pithy, that's with the TH, kind of way of poking fun at corporate media sensationalism and how the corporate media themselves prey upon our schadenfreude sensibilities to laugh at other people's misfortune through humilitainment. That's really negative. So why don't we call attention to that? And instead of finding ourselves plugged in at the end of the day to humilitainment, why don't we plug ourselves into something that's funny at the expense, not of other people, but maybe our own expense, or not at the expense of anybody? Something that just has a different kind of uplifting message that doesn't make us better than someone else in order to feel better about ourselves. Corporate media, they really push those kinds of narratives. So the junk food news chapter this year calls attention to that and says, you know what, turn it off. Don't participate in that. Don't be part of that. Grief porn is another big part of it. Celebrity deaths. While we all bemoan the death of anyone, why are some deaths more important than others? Why do we celebrate anniversaries of deaths and sell memorabilia about it? What exactly are we even celebrating? So the junk food chapter, with a little bit of a wink and a nod, invites us into some of that. The news abuse chapter every year is on propaganda. This year, Robin Anderson does both sides, the other sideism. sort of the looking at the January 6th events and climate crisis and so on. But then in the last chapter, Chris, Solutions Journalism, Media Democracy in Action, every year, we specifically highlight organizations or individuals that are doing what we think is public interest journalism, First Amendment work. This year, we look at Sonali Kahatkar's Rise Up with Sonali. We look at the Critical Media Project out of USC with Allison Trope and DJ Johnson doing great critical media literacy education online for free at criticalmediaproject.org. We've looked at the great work that in the past the people have done at Prop Watch, Propaganda Watch, John Wilson on Academe Blog about censorship in higher education and attacks on academic freedom that is now being manifested in book bans and book challenges. Who's doing something about that? Academe Blog, Banned Books Week Coalition, American Library Association. Librarians are heroes that don't wear capes. You know, don't forget to go down to your local library and hug your local librarian. I mean, if they'll let you, don't get weird. But, you know, give your librarian a heads up. They care about information. They care about your right to read. They care about it for the littlest among us and the eldest among us, right? And so these are the kind of things that we try to foster in our books, is that we want a media literate society. We want people to be critical and affirmative. And we want people to feel like they're in the driver's seat of their own mind, if you would. We're not in the business of telling people what to think. We want to try to help people think better and more critically and be more transparent about the way they think and express themselves about current events through journalism. And ultimately, that's what we do at projectcensored.org. And I certainly invite all of your listeners, your viewers, to check us out. Check out our free information online, maybe even become a monthly subscriber. As we were joking before, you know, this kind of stuff doesn't just run itself. It's certainly a labor of love, but labors of love soon turn to self-exploitation. And, you know, we also need to have some self-care and care for each other, because we don't need to be burned out. We need to burn brighter, but we also need to burn longer. And I think we also need to fuel each other's lights, not try to douse them in the process. So, you know, those are the things we hope to do at Project Censored, Krish. And I know a lot of people that are interested in your kind of work are interested in this kind of thing, and many of them are doing it already. So it's an open invitation to any of the educators and students out there. If you want to get involved, go to projectcensored.org, and we'd love to hear what you think. We'd love to hear what you're saying, and we'd love to maybe incorporate the kind of work you do and grow this network of critically media literate citizens.
That's beautiful. What a great. This is why you're a pro. This is why you're a pro. You like rounded it out. That was beautiful. That was really well done. Thank you so much for doing this. I always look forward to chatting with you, and because it's fun, and you know, like it's
always.
You know, whatever because we're constantly on the brink of oblivion, and having an intellectual conversation where I can like learn and laugh about shit. That's like the best.
It's good stuff. You know, it's the kind of stuff that you do. It's obviously the kind of stuff that people like Lee Camp have been doing. Right, for a long time. I think it's really important, and I think it's also important to rethink what journalism looks like in the 21st century. You know, I mean, I chair a journalism department at a college, but journalism doesn't need to look exactly like it did in Walter Cronkite's days for us to embrace the ethics and the principles behind the medium, right? And I think that we need to be a little bit more creative and a little more open about that, particularly the older among us. I'm over half a century myself these days. So I guess I haven't been able to trust myself for at least 20 years. So I'm privileged to teach younger people and people of many diverse stripes, because they remind me not to believe everything I think. And they remind me that there are new ways. And even if I come kicking and screaming, again, it's the teacher in me that loves to learn. And I'm privileged to learn so much from my students and the great colleagues I have at Project Censored, and the great friends I've met like you and many other people across the world. So I've got a lot of hope for good things, Krish, and a lot of that hope comes from the good people that I've been fortunate to meet.
That's wonderful. That's awesome. I feel like that's the perfect way to wrap this up. Thank you so much for doing this. This was a blast, as always.
It's my pleasure, Krish. Keep up the great work, man. I really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yep.
And
Skadoosh! There it is. Mickey Huff from Project Censored. Please go check them out and purchase their books. Um, go to projectcensored.org, projectcensored.org. You can grab their new book, State of the Free Press 2022, The News That Didn't Make the News and Why. And why? That's the big part. That's the big part. It's not just reporting these are the stories, but there's also a reason why these stories didn't get reported, and that is very important to know as well. What is so threatening, to address these stories in a objective, accurate way, and why that's a threat to the state. Why is that a threat to corporate journalism? They have a bunch of other books available on their website as well. The Anatomy of Fake News, a critical news literacy education that you can get on their website as well. They have a ton of stuff that you can listen to the show. This Project Censored radio show and podcast is available on projectcensored.org as well. They list off a lot of their partner website, like Empire Files, which is a great anti-war news outlet hosted by Abby Martin. Media Roots, Mass Media Literacy, Mint Press News, which is another great journalistic outlet as well. From a woman's point of view, that's another source that they partner with as well. So, if you're interested in learning about the world and you pay attention to the news, right? This is something that people like to brag about quite often is, oh, well, I read the news. I read many magazines on many leather-bound books and mahogany tables and chairs and things of that sort. And, we do. And we kind of boast about it and we kind of use, I know I've definitely done it, right? We kind of boast about our what I don't even really know what to call it, but it's like our intellect, like what we know, what we've read. I've read the New Yorker, so my IQ is clearly at a 143. Where you reading your independent journalist is obviously your IQ is at a mere 94. Like we have this mentality. Well, here you go, and they claim that their sources are more upstanding than your sources. This is often what ends up happening in debates, and I hate debates for various different reasons. We'll get into that later if we get into that at all. But we get into these debates. But here we actually have people at projectcensored.org that have written works that explain to you what these biases are, where they're coming from, and why they are used. And they're clearly defining what the ethics of journalism is, what makes a trusted source an actual trusted source, right? So I kind of wanted to go through that again before we go into that. Projectcensored.org. Buy the new book, The State of the Free Press, The News That Didn't Make the News and Why. Grab that book today. Grab it right now. I hope you guys are all rushing to projectcensored.org to get your copy of the books. But again, the and why is really the important part. I think that's and why is something that is often missing from our discourse. But to go back to the notion of, trusted news sources and things like that, I do want to talk a little bit more about what the Society of Professional Journalists say about the Code of Ethics for Journalists, which makes a trusted news source. So I kind of want to go over that. So what is the SPJ, the Society of Professional Journalists? This is directly off of their website, spj.org. The Society of Professional Journalists is the nation's most broad-based journalism organization dedicated to encouraging the free practice of journalism and stimulating high standards of ethical behavior. Founded in 1909 as Sigma Delta Chi, SBJ promotes the free flow of information vital to well-informed citizenry through the daily work of its roughly 6,000 members, works to inspire and educate current and future journalists through professional development and protects First Amendment guarantees of freedom of speech and press through its advocacy efforts. That's directly on their website. Some other things they do. This is what we do. We are champions for journalists. That's what the SPJ is. They're champions for journalists. We recognize the achievements of journalists and best practices of media organizations through award programs. We educate journalists on their best skills and practices. We create products and services that instill pride in the vocation of journalists in all stages are clear. We encourage news organizations to build newsrooms that are diverse, equitable, and inclusive. We're fighters for the First Amendment. We monitor and fight against efforts to violate the First Amendment and suppress free press. We just saw RT being shut down for question mark reasons, right? They're claiming it's funding reasons, but again, that's not the entire story. So right there, we've seen two problems with the way the shutdown of RT happened and is reported. This is so the SPJ would be against something like that because it suppresses free press. We defend journalists through legal defense funds, and activate initiatives to protect the First Amendment through our First Amendment Forever Fund. So there you go. If you want to help journalists who people like Steven Donziger, who gets sued by Exxon for revealing how fucking awful they are and all of the crimes they were committing, the human rights violations they were committing in South America, then this is a fund that kind of helps them do that. And the reason why we need to do that is because of the way the legal system is set up. Is that average people like you and me can't really afford one lawyer, let alone a team of them, whereas corporations have them on retainer. So they are far better equipped to deal with the legal system than average individuals such as ourselves. So that's where organizations like the SPJ come into play. Another thing they say, this is the other thing, we're fighters for the First Amendment. We increase public awareness and support the First Amendment through training and education. So and this is just some of the stuff that's on their website. This isn't everything, obviously, but that kind of shows you where they're coming from, right? And if if you kind of read through that, you go, okay, if these are the standards that we are going to abide by, let's look at what the Society of Professional Journalists says about the code of ethics for journalists, right? So the first code of ethics, we discussed this in the episode itself, and these will also be listed in the description as well. For number one, seek truth and report it. Ethical journalism should be accurate and fair. Journalists should be honest and courageous in gathering, reporting, and interpreting information. Journalists should take responsibility for the accuracy of their work, verify information before releasing it, use original sources whenever possible. Remember that neither speed nor format excuses inaccuracy. Provide context. Take special care not to misrepresent or oversimplify in promoting, previewing, or summarizing a story. Gather, update, and correct information throughout the life of a news story. Be cautious when making promises, but keep promises they make. Identify sources clearly. The public is entitled to as much information as possible to judge the reliability and motivations of sources. Consider sources' motives before promising anonymity. Reserve anonymity for sources who may face danger, retribution, or other harm and have information that cannot be obtained elsewhere. Explain why anonymity was granted. Diligently seek subjects of news coverage to allow them to respond to criticism or allegations of wrongdoing. Avoid undercover or surreptitious methods of gathering information unless traditional open methods will not yield information vital to the public. Be vigilant and courageous about holding those with power accountable. Give voice to the voiceless. Support the open and civil exchange of views, even views they find repugnant. Recognize a special obligation to serve as watchdogs over public affairs and government. Seek to ensure that the public's business is conducted in open and that public records are open to all. Provide access to source material when it is relevant and appropriate. Boldly tell the story of diversity and magnitude of the human experience. Seek sources whose voices we seldom hear. Avoid stereotyping. Journalists should examine the ways their values and experiences may shape their reporting. Label advocacy and commentary. Never deliberately distort facts or context, including visual information. Clearly label illustrations and reenactments. Never plagiarize, always attribute. So that's the first one. That's in detail a little bit of what the first one says. Number 2, minimize harm. Ethical journalism treats sources, subjects, colleagues, and members of the public as human beings deserving of respect. Journalists should balance the public need for information against potential harm or discomfort. Pursuit of the news is not license for arrogance or undue intrusiveness. Show compassion for those who may be affected by news coverage. Use heightened sensitivity when dealing with juveniles, victims of sex crimes, and sources or subjects who are inexperienced to unable to give consent. Consider cultural differences in approach and treatment. Recognize that legal access to information differs from an ethical justification to publish or broadcast. Realize that private people have a greater right to control information about themselves than public figures and others who seek power, influence, or attention. Weigh the consequences of publishing or broadcasting information. Avoid pandering to lurid curiosity, even if others do so. Balance a suspect's right to a fair trial with the public's right to know. Consider the implications of identifying criminal suspects before they face legal charges. Consider the long-term implications of the extended reach and permanence of publication. Provide updated and more complete information as appropriate. Number 3, act independently. The highest and primary obligation of ethical journalism is to serve the public. Journalists should avoid conflicts of interests, real or perceived, disclose unavoidable conflicts, reuse gifts, favors, fees, free travel, and special treatment, and avoid political and otherwise outside activities that may compromise integrity or impartiality or may damage credibility. Be wary of the sources offering information for favors or money. Do not pay for access to news. Identify content provided by outside sources, whether paid or not. Deny favored treatment to advertisers, donors, or any other special interests, and resist internal and external pressures to influence coverage. Distinguish news from advertising and shun hybrids that blur the line between the two. Prominently label sponsored content. Number 4, be accountable and transparent. Ethical journalism means taking responsibility for one's work and explaining one's decision to the public. Explain ethical choices and processes to audiences. Encourage a civil dialogue with the public about journalistic practices, coverage, and news content. Respond quickly to questions about accuracy, clarity, and fairness. Acknowledge mistakes and correct them promptly and prominently. Explain corrections and clarifications carefully and clearly. Expose unethical conduct in journalism, including within their organization. Abide by the same high standards they expect of others. So there you go. That's what the SPJ's Code of Ethics for Journalists has to say. That's word for word directly off their website. I downloaded their poster and their bookmark that I'm going to print out and regularly use, and it'll probably be on my background here shortly as well once I get it all printed and everything. So there you go. You can kind of hear what makes objective journalism objective. What are the standards that they are operating within? And ask yourself and be very honest. Go through all of that again. Again, you can go to sbj.org and see what these code of ethics are, exactly what I read off their website. You can even go into a little bit further detail. In fact, I probably will. I probably will take a little bit of a deep dive into that, specifically from the SPJ perspective, and comment on it. I find it to be a very excellent standard to saying what is and isn't a credible source, and what isn't journalism. And so with that, I propose the question to you guys, dear listeners. Do you believe that NPR or BBC or CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, these corporate media outlets, do you believe that they are holding up to journalistic standards? And if they are not, well, why are you advocating for them as if they are, especially when there are easily accessible alternatives that some that Project Censored lists themselves, that meet all of these criteria? That is a question that I think internally a lot of people need to ask and answer. And look, and nobody's forcing you to. You don't have to. One easy way of getting through that is just denial of any of this stuff, right? Which is something that I've also heard. And it is rather disappointing to see and hear when that sort of stuff happens. But I think it's a question we should ask ourselves. I think it's a question that we should pose to the media, as much as the media is the watchdog for public policy and all that sort of stuff, right? We should be the watchdogs of the media and say, hey, I don't think this is fair. I don't think this is holding up to the journalistic standards, especially under the code of ethics, and push back on that. Especially now in the age of social media, when we have a platform to speak and ensure that the First Amendment is upheld to its best, right? And there's a lot more to kind of say. I'm actually writing a rather large piece about processing a lot of the stuff that's happened, and how and the reason I think I need to write it, because in the case of the Ukrainian invasion, there has been a lot of missing information. There's been a lot of misinformation, and I want to and for me, that there is a mix of the personal with the political, because and directly, not there's no indirect stuff. I think that's a complicated phrase, but I think you understand what I mean. But there has been a mix of that. So there's a lot of my own emotions and my own personal feelings on it, that I think I want to share public, like what I want to share publicly, the relevant stuff that I want to share publicly. And hopefully the idea is to have a little bit more clarity and understanding of the situation from a critical thought perspective and a historical context, but to also kind of understand that when we're having conversations about difficult things, that there is a person on the other side, and the way you talk to these people and the language that you use, which I believe is motivated by the media coverage of these things, does affect other people. You are speaking to another human being, and to really start taking that into consideration. And in a lot of respects, when it comes to issues like this, when it comes to crises like this, emotions lead first, right? We are highly reactive. We are a highly reactive society, and for people that aren't reactive, I'm not particularly a reactive person, and I used to be. I was far more reactive, but it was pretty negative, and it affected my relationships negatively, and I realized that, and I started working on being less reactive and being more understanding, and trying to find more information and talk to people, and People are not willing to give information to people that they don't trust, and they definitely don't trust people that are coming at them with intense aggression, right? And that applies to everybody everywhere. I'm not just talking about the left or whatever. I think this is just a human problem that I've noticed is we come at people, we're aggressive towards them, but I think it's because we're trying to dominate and win the conversation rather than just have one. So that's kind of the idea behind it. I'm going to do my best to kind of articulate those goals and all that. So I am working on that piece. It's rather large. It's rather involved and complicated, and kind of covers a lot of stuff, and breaking it down and organizing it to the best of my ability, along with all of the other kind of stuff that I have going on. So it might take a little while to come out. But I stand, very much by what I said last week. Um, I don't think there's any good guys in this war. I don't think any war ever has a very clear good guy. Most wars, I will say, I won't put the absolute on it, but I don't think there is. And I think looking for a good guy, um, and rejecting information that counters such is pretty dangerous, and is again kind of evidence of a very reactive society, where emotional education, also takes precedence to all of the things that are culminating around us. So, anyway, I'm going to wrap things up here. I hope this was an informative podcast. I hope that you guys got something out of it. I hope it got some of you folks that are kind of on the fence about a lot of this stuff. I hope it got you thinking about a few things. That's my hope. But till next week, I've got a couple of pretty great podcasts that I'm recording, that I'm going to be releasing. A lot of it is going to be connected to the crisis in Ukraine, because we are kind of seeing things escalate, and there's options for de-escalation, but it doesn't seem to be taking. But again, that's to say that a lot of the content will be kind of directed and focused, um, towards that topic. So, but it is also just like the biggest story, of our day. So, um, yeah. Anyway, let's wrap things up here. Make sure you guys take care of yourselves and take care of those around you. Be good to you. Be good to yourselves. Until next week, stay taboo, everybody.